Hey, so there was a comment in the last video about the sound. I'm blaming it on the microphone I used in the last video. So we'll see if this does any better. Um, it'll do a little better at least. Anyway, so the topic of this video is going to be the um, cognitive distortion, shall we call it, of catastrophizing, what it is, and how it has been the most problematic cognitive distortion in my life, why, how it develops, and everything, and um, any solutions or advice I would have towards someone who can identify with it. Okay, so humans by and large have uh, I guess it's kind of like, we tend to, a lot of us tend to like discount positive possible outcomes and focus more on negative outcomes. I think this is called a negativity bias or something in one of those disciplines and studies kind of thing. That it's been something that we're hardwired biologically to have a negativity bias because it's linked with survival. More so back in the day, but way back in the day, but way back in the day. But I think it's still for a lot of us feels natural. It's our first inclination. First thought is typically negative. But then there's those of us who will take it a little bit further, which is what is called catastrophizing. And again, this is listed as a cognitive distortion, along with stuff like personalizing and whatnot. And that is basically a fancy word for worst case scenarioing. So always wondering, what's the worst possible thing that could happen. An example, I'm late for work and I already have two attendance violations. I'm getting my third strike now. What's the worst thing that could happen? The catastrophe would be losing one's job. Um, this isn't difficult to explain. We all do it to some extent. Some of us more than others. Some of us way more than others. But yeah, catastrophizing, worst case scenarioing, and going about your day doing this, as often as possible. When you see situations with uncertain outcomes, you kind of uh, spread those outcomes out in front of you and focus on the negative ones. Um, for me, at least, I link this with something that I called dominoing, meaning that I'll look at different outcomes, the negative possible outcomes from things, and then not just the negative outcome, as in my example, loss of job for the attendance violation, but then the dominoes would be loss of job, inability to pay bills, eviction, homelessness, relapse, etc. So, with all of the negative outcomes, I see various ways that could be the first domino in a continued sequence of negative outcomes. Um, what this also lends itself to is what we'll call backup planning, contingency planning. So for every possible bad outcome, you develop some type of backup plan, so that hey, it's not that bad. So in the example, with the job, it might be if I get fired from my job, I have backup job options, or I can get a loan from this place, or I can talk to my landlord in this way, broker a deal with him or her in this way, and that kind of thing. So, kind of fleshing out all the various bad outcomes or bad possible outcomes from an uncertain situation, and developing some type of contingency that or life preserver or mitigation of sorts from the downfall, as early in the domino sequence as possible, um, uh, and whatnot, and just doing this all day, chronically doing this all day, to a point that yes, it's irrational in nature, but yet, at least in my experience, it's like a weird dark version of self care, where it feels like being prepared for anything and everything is a form of self care. So when people from the therapy world, will say, you're displaying negative thinking, cognitive distortion that you need to address with cognitive behavioral therapy. I know they like to use like stop thought exercises is the proper term for it, to kind of break one out of the catastrophizing, backup planning, etc. loops, um, which in turn prevent one from staying in the moment, or whatnot. So it is exhausting. I mean, just on an energy level too, doing this all day. Categorize it as overthinking and overthinking fatigue. Like it is exhausting. So I think that one of the reasons why this gets to us, especially like whether to the extent that it becomes such a neurotic, uh, doing it at a neurotic level. Um, when we're drug addicts and we get down and out, well, we hit rock bottom, we're homeless, we're whatever. Um, we're kind of always doing this, and it as part of survival mode, be it to secure money, to not lose things, to not go into withdrawal or whatever. It's always on our minds how things could go wrong. What's the worst way they could possibly go wrong, and what are we going to do in that situation? Um, and yeah, it does feel very much like survival, and even not during addiction. Like you might be in like early recovery, but early recovery can very much still feel like the proverbial survival mode. Because maybe in early recovery, you just started working and you're trying to like survive financially and rebuild your life, but everything's a mess and you have all this collateral damage you have to address, and everything's so sensitive to. It might not even be early recovery. It could just be like the fact that the majority of people are living paycheck to paycheck, and that feels like a form of survival mode where a lot of people are one paycheck away from something very bad or whatever. So I think it we can train ourselves, especially when we're living in situations, even clean, sober, and whatnot, that still feel in a way like survival mode, where you don't feel like you have a safety net that matches the magnitude of your uncertainties or your worst case scenarios. Um, so I think that perhaps bottoming out and being drug addicts and whatnot can prime us to fall into this type of thinking pattern that sticks with us even after we get clean and whatnot. But yeah, like in the sense of it being part of survival mode, survival um, uh, feels like a weird form of self care, at least defined in the sense of, well, if I don't do this, my life will get worse. So perhaps if I do this, my life won't get any worse. And that kind of um, is accepted by yourself as self care. So you get very defensive of it. Um, and it feels very threatening, the thought of like giving this up or not doing this, because it feels like taking a step into a vulnerable territory that you don't feel like you want to step into. I mean, I know a lot of people deal with this with not wanting to step into emotionally vulnerable territory in recovery circles and whatnot. Um, that's never been too difficult for me, but stuff like, yeah, like trying to give up the catastrophizing, like none of the cognitive behavioral stuff really works on me for that. Like the only thing that I've ever been able to kind of train myself to do is to um, focus on silver linings in bad situations. Because something I've kind of realized is that like I'm very good at being a buzzkill. I'm very good at looking at something that is good, especially like looking at it as a whole group that I'm involved in looks at it, and the group's overrun with joy and happiness, and everybody's happy and happy as a group and whatnot. And I'm the buzzkill. I'm able to find fault in things. I'm able to my joy in the moment isn't so overwhelming that I'm not still able to rationally, logically find fault in things and be a buzzkill. But in kind of a yin yang way, like I feel like you're using the same muscle to find silver linings in bad situations. And I do admittedly get overrun emotionally in bad situations to the detriment of my ability to find silver linings in bad situations. So just as of very recently, this is something that I've really tried to work on, is reminding myself that it is kind of the same muscle that finds silver linings in bad situations as finds fault in good situations. So finding, as I do my catastrophizing and backup planning, trying to find silver linings in every branch that might possibly happen and focus on those and whatnot. Um, Obviously, that doesn't do away with anywhere near all of the neurosis, but it does add a certain softness to it and a certain um, a little bit more openness to acceptance of things, um, because I'm not one of those people that can quote unquote live life on life's terms. So it's very hard for me to just blindly accept something as the token God's will or man's destiny or whatever. So um, I do have to use something like this, like focusing on silver linings, so that whatever you know um, does admittedly happen out of my control, there is still some relation to it that I have a control over. If that makes sense.